I wonder if anybody else besides me has observed the disconnect between us engineers, and I include us as engineers, Jessica, and the policymakers in Washington. Because just think about what you heard earlier today. The people in the first session never answered their question 10 times or 100 times for MIMO. Well, I want to take on their job and tell you what the answer is. Turns out that 10 times is today and yesterday. 100 times is within the next year or so. And the long-term answer, long-term meaning 2025, that's only 10 years, at least 500 times. What does that mean? 500 times more throughput, the equivalent of having 500 times more spectrum than we have today. It's not a pipe dream. How do I know that? Well, the group who creates and pushes forward the LTE standard has just announced that by the end of the year, the improvements in the LTE standard that will get up to 80 times increase in spectrum will be part of the standard. So this is not yesterday's technology, it's today's technology. Just 2 weeks ago, a small company in San Diego that makes a large percentage of the little antennas that go in your cell phones has announced that they have a new switched antenna that will cost roughly $1 for every cell phone. This antenna will increase the capacity, if every cell phone was equipped with this antenna, will increase the capacity of the existing spectrum by 30%. So you wonder, with all of these things that are realities, why we are putting all of this effort in this arduous process of taking spectrum away from one entity who will never give it up without a fight, and providing it to other entities over periods that extend beyond 10 years and at enormous cost, billions of dollars of cost. So there's a disconnect. One way or another, we have to face this problem and start communicating better. But that's not the purpose of our panel this afternoon. Our panel is going to talk about spectrum sharing, and spectrum sharing is the long-term solution. And in contrast with the previous panel, I'm going to give you the answer right now. Because the question was, how far can we go in sharing? And the answer to that is farther than you could ever have imagined. And the way I would like to describe that to you is to talk about what is the ultimate system. Now, when I talk about ultimate, I'm not talking about pipe dreams again. I'm talking about known technologies carried to a degree that we understand will work, scientific realities. So think about what is it that constrains the efficiency of using spectrum. There are only 4 things. It's not a very complicated problem. Number 1 is how much time does the user use the spectrum? And we've solved that problem. When we talk, we use the spectrum. When we stop talking, we allow other people to use the spectrum. So from the standpoint of time, we're already pretty efficient. The second thing that we do is use the bandwidth. How much bandwidth do we need for a given transmission? And it turns out that the limit there is a thing we call Shannon's law. It says for a given signal-to-noise ratio, there's a theoretical limit to how much information you can put on a given channel. Well, because of advances in science, we're pretty much there. You can't squeeze much more through a given channel with a given signal-to-noise than what we know how to do today. The next one is geographic sharing. And that's what we were talking about earlier today. That's what MIMO does. It allows you to reuse the spectrum over and over again to get around Shannon's law. And it turns out we are really learning how to do that in some incredibly efficient ways. And just that alone, as you heard earlier today, can give us improvements of the order of 500 times. But there is a 4th way, and Commissioner Rosenworcel alluded to that, and that is to somehow optimize the band that you're using. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have a person in a city talking to a cell site that may be across the street and using 700 megahertz. It doesn't make any sense at all. This is a band that has propagation characteristics that are suitable for 10 miles or more. Why not use 60 or 90 megahertz for those? So for this ultimate system that I'm describing, you ought to be able to select the optimum frequency band. If you do all four of those things, I hesitate to tell you what my calculations are for the improvement in spectral efficiency, because I'm going to lose all credibility. But it is thousands of times improvement. It is enough improvement so you could envision, when we adopt these technologies, that every person on Earth could be watching a 4D video on their cell phones simultaneously and not even stretch the capabilities of the system. And there are two technologies that somehow have been elusive, and suddenly within the last 6 months, I discovered that they exist. Number one is, you've heard a lot of talk about cognitive radio. Well, cognitive radio works, it has one problem. What you do in cognitive radio is listen, and if there's nobody on the channel, you can use that channel. But that doesn't tell you about people that aren't transmitting at a given moment. And it doesn't tell you all the characteristics of this return path. In the last month, I discovered that a small company has come up, excuse me, with a technology that allows you to use GPS signals to create a model of the world, an RF model, so you know in which directions you can transmit without interfering and which directions you should avoid transmitting. Put all these things together, we have an enormous capacity and the opportunity to have true sharing. What does that mean? Well, no more allocations. Anybody that wants to come into a band, anybody that wants, not a band, into the spectrum, anybody that wants to come in can come in as long as they follow the rules. Use the kinds of rules that I've talked about before. And because you have essentially infinite spectrum, nobody's going to interfere with anybody else. A whole new world. So that's what this panel is going to talk about. Because there are some problems involved in this. There are problems involved in the enforcement, the transition, legal problems. And we have some panelists today that could not be more suited to answering these questions. And so let me start off by, where are my panelists? Well, let me tell you who they are as they come up here. The first speaker is going to be Dennis Roberson, who is Vice Provost of the Illinois Institute of Technology. He's also the founder and head of Roberson and Associates. And in his spare time, he's the, what's your official title on the FCC? He's the chairman of the FCC Technology Advisory Committee. David Goldman is senior advisor to Commissioner Rosenworcel. David has been involved in spectrum. He worked for the Congress for a long time, and now he's doing a really good job with Commissioner Rosenworcel, because I don't think she did all of that all by herself. Janice Obuchowski has worked, she's been a senior advisor to the chairman of the commission. She was Undersecretary of Commerce for communications in past administrations, and is now running her own consulting firm and is very bright on the technical and legal issues of spectrum. And Joan Marsh, who's with AT&T, our sponsor, and Joan is head of regulatory affairs for AT&T. So I can't imagine a group that can speak more intelligently on these subjects. So Dennis, the floor is yours.
Good morning. It's great to be with you. I'm going to go through a couple of PowerPoints, and given the two talks that you've just heard, many of the points have already been made, but I'll use a couple of PowerPoints that give some pictures that go behind it. And given the earlier challenges with the clicker, I think I'll take the coward's way out and have you just advance them for me if you would. The first slide is the one that you're all very familiar with that says, all of the spectrum is allocated. The second slide, however, which is the one at the break, says that it's not all being used. The one at the break was a real time, this is just a snapshot, but as you can see, there are many areas of the spectrum that are in fact in the city of Chicago, a very significant urban center, are not being used. And if we go to the third slide, it breaks this down into bands and shows the relative usage, and I won't go through all the details. Marty was quite worried that I would take you in a long tour of these slides, but this gives you the maximum, minimum, and average usage across the relevant bands going up to the 3 gigahertz range that you heard about as being the top end of where we currently use the spectrum. If we go to the next one, this was 14%, this is 15% utilization across this band. I highlight with the little circle the fact that some of it changes. This was the relevant years, and this is why I chose these years, of the transition of the 700 megahertz band from television use to 4G LTE, among other things, in Chicago. Next slide talks about sharing. We've already heard a lot about sharing, and people tend to talk about sharing as though it were something new. And in fact, there's nothing new about sharing. We've been sharing spectrum since the days of Marconi, once he set up the second system and found that there was interference. So we've been doing frequency sharing, later time-based sharing, spatial sharing, the location of sets, temporal spatial sharing, and MIMO clearly fits into this area as well. But there's lots of sharing going on from historic standpoint to the current. Next slide. There are lots of opportunities for the future. Right now, huge focus on database focus sharing, using our computational resources. Not quite yet going to the point of mapping the entire planet, as Marty has suggested, but that's out there. The ability to use that and combine it with or use sensor-based, beacon-based capabilities, mix and match to give you this characteristic. The transmission polarization, signal nulling that is again part of MIMO, but it goes beyond that as well so that you can use a single channel in both directions. But sharing both has been, is today, the way to go in terms of taking advantage of that first chart. Next slide. The key to this is what you've already heard. If we share, as we teach our kindergartners, the toys that are out there, the limited supply of spectrum, we really are in the place where, to quote the PCAST report, and I was part of this, we move the whole notion of spectrum from an area of scarcity to abundance, and that's what Marty shared with us. And with that, I'm done.
Well, thank you, Dennis. So there you have it. How is it that we have, over the past 100 years, improved our spectral efficiency by doubling it every 2.5 years, so that in the first 50 years, we got 1 million times better spectral efficiency, and we did it again in the next 50 years. And the reason we can do it again in the next 50 years, as Dennis has just pointed out, is we're just so rotten and lousy at it today. We are doing a terrible job at spectral efficiency compared to what can be done. So our next speaker is David Goldman, who I've already introduced before, so I don't have to say anything more.
Well, first I just want to say thank you. Marty Cooper asking me to speak about spectrum is really kind of like one of the honors of my career, so I really do appreciate it. It's always nice when people who actually make things for a living want to talk to people who just talk about people who make things for a living. So I feel a little validated. And I guess just my last disclaimer is normally as I work for Commissioner Rosenworcel, who you heard from earlier. Normally when I'm asked to speak publicly, I'm kind of speaking on her behalf. And she hasn't said much about Spectrum 2025 yet, so I get to speak for myself a little bit here. I guess the disclaimer is, anything I say you think is smart, I got from her. The rest of it is my own. And I'll be as the person on the panel who kind of works at the FCC, I thought I would take kind of an FCC perspective. And I'll start out by kind of going exactly the opposite of what Marty asked for, of looking 10 years ahead. I'm actually going to start 100 years back and start with when the Titanic hit the iceberg. And as it was going down, they went and used their Marconi radio and called for help. And that spurred a panic because the signal was picked up by a number of different Marconi radio stations along the coasts, and the information got garbled. Everyone immediately turned on their radios, tried to get as much information as they could. They were overpowering each other. There was miscommunications. It was a disaster. But that said, they do attribute there were 700 lives saved from the Titanic. They say that the Marconi radio was what saved those 700 lives. That said, that act, what happened there is what really spurred Congress to pass the Radio Act of 1912. And what the Radio Act did was the first time that the government pretty much claimed ownership over the spectrum and assigned wavelengths to particular users for particular uses. They put priorities for during maritime disasters, which makes sense. They started, for the first time, assigning which wavelengths you could be used for commercial purposes versus federal purposes. And I say wavelengths as opposed to frequencies because at the time they actually assigned it by wavelength, so it was a different system. But so the point being, this wasn't a total digression. The point being, the initial idea behind allocating spectrum was not based off of a scarcity problem. It was based off of priorities and usage, and basically they needed some central planning. What the Titanic disaster showed them was that there needed to be some sort of central organization. And the Radio Act of 1912 eventually is what evolved into the Communications Act, which created the FCC, and the FCC took on that role. So I think as we look ahead and we look at this future of efficiency with much higher use of the spectrum, I think that there still will continue to be a role for the FCC in allocation, even in that world. I think of it, if you translate it to the real estate analogy, you can have a town that's a small town that no one's complaining that they don't have enough land, but it still is not a bad idea to have zoning. You still don't necessarily want to have schools next to the pub. And I think that there still is some use for the FCC to do some sort of central planning, some sort of zoning of the spectrum to make sure that the correct uses are all next to each other. If in real estate good fences make good neighbors, I think good interference rules, for example, make good spectral neighbors, and figuring out how to get that done. But now, as we talk about kind of the frequency hopping ideas that Dennis was talking about, we start thinking about, that's where the real estate analogy kind of breaks down, unless we all kind of rotate houses depending on who's there, but that starts being confusing to me. But that actually, even the breakdown of that analogy actually, to me, raises another role for the FCC and a complexity for the FCC, is that as we talk about these really interesting dynamic spectrum uses, the enforcement piece of it becomes really complicated. Already, if everything was fixed, all transmissions were fixed, it would be easy. We could drive up in our black vans and kind of kick people's doors in and retune their radios. But even now, as signals move more, it becomes harder and harder for our enforcement. As the signal is not only moving, but jumping from frequency to frequency in real time, it becomes nearly impossible for our traditional enforcement techniques to work. So I think that there's going to be a role, and there's really going to be a difficulty over the next 10 years of figuring out how do we write enforceable rules And there's, to be frank, there's somewhat of a tension between allowing as much dynamic access as you want with making sure these rules are actually enforceable. I don't think that the FCC's rule should be keeping us from evolving to the place that we want to evolve, but I do think that there's going to be some complexities there that we're going to have to really think deeply about. But so thank you again for letting me.
Oh, thanks, David. So David's comment is that the role of the FCC is still going to be there, but there are going to be some changes. And I think what you're saying is that there has to be a more emphasis on the enforcement end, because this system that I described, if you've got somebody that doesn't follow these rules, they mess everybody up. So I think that's very intelligent, but I hope we can develop that just a bit more. So thank you very much, David. Janice, you're up.
Okay. I brought 9 slides, but don't worry about that. I don't intend to use the 9 slides. And I'll use the same hand motion, I guess, when we move on. Answering the specific question, future of sharing? Sharing is absolutely inevitable. As has been pointed out, it happens a lot more than we probably are sometimes aware of today. But when you look at the growth of mobile usage, 100 times, 1,000 times, even more, it's inevitable. There's a bit of a fiction out there that there's somewhere some fallow spectrum or some radically underutilized spectrum. Well, you know, in fact, in the prime bands, there's always somebody that gets displaced, sometimes for the good. But in any event, in this new world that we're going to envision, there's going to be absolutely no alternative to share. And I think one of the great developments in the dialogue over the last 5 years has been that realization. So the fully realized future, moving to the next slide, is as has been presented. You know, far be it for me, a former antitrust lawyer, to sit here in the company of some of the giants of technology and recast what they've said, but I would wholly subscribe to the vision. Marty articulated the technologies that are going to make it happen. The preceding panel gave us a graduate course in that. You know, I'm one of those people that have lived through the CDMA, TDMA, GSM wars, moved through 4 different generations of LTE, and now we're looking at the 5th generation. And what has been sort of a fantastic voyage there is to see that we've moved from technology religious wars. Is the real game changer going to be the smart antennas, or is it going to be smart coding, or is it going to be recalibration of the architecture, to get to something that I think speaks very well to you technologists. We've reached a solution, and we're seeing it in the article that Marty circulated on 5G, where the solution is all of the above. So I have no doubt that that future, the fully realized future, is ours, and the icons, the geniuses, and the people who follow them in the audience have made enormous strides to bring it to us. Next slide is on technology development. I just put it in there to show that a lawyer can talk pigeon engineering. I think we've covered that one. But as we move to magical thinking, this is a concern I do have. All of this is real, but when you get from here to there becomes the tough question. Part of it is that there are diverse stakeholders embracing very different visions, and enormous economic interests underlie them. That somehow has to be mediated. It's not always terribly well mediated in the political environment. Sharing also, and the technology that underpins it, is a global phenomenon, but global standards have not yet been achieved, and that's going to take a lot of just tough blocking and tackling to make it a reality. And in fact, core telecom services still rely very heavily on carrier nets. Those network providers need to be compensated for that, but we're moving towards an environment of protected infrastructure, lightly regulated competitors, and unregulated networks and apps. And in that environment, there are many different economic interests. So we may reach technology nirvana before we get these interests well understood and achieve the same kind of consensus that 5G has achieved in the regulatory environment. We're far from it. Moving to the next slide on regulatory experimentation, you see a lot of steps towards this new world of sharing and this new world of abundance, but I wouldn't say we've gotten as far as the technology is. And in fact, I think David has already spoken to this. We have 21st century technology, and at best, we have 1970s enforcement. The FCC, to be honest, has pathetic ability to do testing. The budgets are very, very scarce. We have to rely on good-hearted people like Dennis and his entity to really go out there and measure what's going on in the reality of our streets. The FCC does its best. Their tools are limited, and when there's a problem, we assume good faith. Well, every one of the speakers talking about the fully realized future said the assumption is good faith. I think we can say that's generally the case, but I do worry. I worry, first off, about the cyber threat. When you talk about these enormously complex databases and exchanges of information, how are we going to protect that information? Because just as people can jam, people can break into any kind of database, how are we going to protect that database? I look at that as a recipe to bring the West to its knees. I actually am one of those people that insists on having a physical key to my car, so when all else fails, I can get out and leave. Because I don't think that threat has been realized. I think it's so important that people almost look away because it's not an easy solution set. And then on the enforcement that's not quite so, oriented towards the utter fear factor, you do have problems that can be real competitive ones. And I wanted to highlight one that came up in the 5G environment where, first off, there was attempt at sharing between federal and commercial. That moved out of my era at the WRC. First off, some of the federal databases were imperfect, so industry wasn't quite sure about what they needed to protect. That got sorted out, and there were still really big interference problems. Well, it turned out, and Cisco's put this in the record, there was a Motorola equipment that could be tampered with that was operating out of band. Well, it took the FCC a year. They froze the bands. They stopped, this isn't working, we have interference with the federal systems. By the time they sorted it all out, a year had elapsed. And guess what? Cisco lost its lead to market. They were mightily unhappy. They put this in the record, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of a simple example, but that's the kind of reality that has to be ironed out in the enforcement environment. You can't freeze bans for years while you sort out the enforcement issues, but we don't have the technology, we don't have the answers, we can't have people running into federal court every time they feel aggrieved. So I've kind of covered those points of security, monitoring, and enforcement. Enforcement, yet again, is a tough call. When you have federal, commercial interference, we're involved, Dennis and I, in the CSMAC. You actually get down to the constitutional business. Where do you go to stop the federal government from interfering? And vice versa, what can the federal government do, or what should it do, to control commercial interference with itself? Right now, that's all negotiated in good faith, behind closed doors, not really behind closed doors, but the IRAC and OET. Good people achieve good problems, good solutions. But in the new world of sharing, massive sharing, it's not at all clear how we're going to resolve those things in real time to the benefit of society. And then you get, since I've got the floor, more spectrum for what? Here I'm speaking, I guess, addressing all you icons of technology to think in the world, think as all the great icons did, including the one whose statue's out front, Albert Einstein. Let's bring a moral component to this powerful, powerful tool that we're unleashing. And I'm speaking as an old mom of kids that have just walked through teenage. For all the enormous benefits of this technology, do I really believe my son is using it for healthcare apps? As I've rhetorically said, as I've scanned suburban high school population, just about every bad idea within a radius of 12 miles of my home has somehow entered into the ecosystem of all the high school males that I've run into on any given Saturday night. And you now superimpose on some of that this new sort of overcorrection to privacy issues, where it may well be impossible. Google's proud of it. It's a consumer benefit. No ability for government to get into these handsets. I'm not sure that's such a good thing. It's a great thing for us. But if you look at the reality of predators, the kinds of services that open this world up to teenagers and predators, how are we going to go after them? So going on to more spectrum for what? I'm not sure. We're well past this one. It's I think it's slide 8. I pulled out of my last point on that from the Arlington Catholic Herald back to school section, a column for parents trying to educate them on their grade school and high school students and what they ought to be aware of. And you can read the list there. Anonymous ability to superimpose messages on pictures. And then there's my favorite, Snapchat, with a market valuation of potentially $10 billion. What is that? Disappearing photos. Again, if I'm communicating with anybody in this audience, I don't have to worry about my message disappearing in the next 5 seconds. So that $10 billion valuation is built on what? Probably not something that socially beneficial, especially if you're a parent. So that kind of runs through my soapbox on this. Just to close, we have the intended and the unintended consequences. These technologies are enormously powerful forces for tremendous good. Economic good and public good is obvious. I do worry, and I say this as a conservative, it's not a political debating point, about digital dividends and digital divides. One last little vignette. One of my friend's brilliant daughters, left Columbia, did all the right things, taught at Teach for America, listed in Forbes as one of the 30 biggest education apps in the country. So a parent of my age went to one of her parties out in Silicon Valley, and he came home and announced to all of our parents, yeah, Tess had a great party. There were 30, graduates. They're brilliant kids. They're all excited. They're energized. They're doing important work. Not a single one of them had a job that existed when we left college. That's great. It's terrific. But I do worry, again, as somebody who's a member of our broader society, that works perhaps for the top 20% of kids, young adults coming out, but we're seeing enormous dislocations. And I don't know the answer to it, but I want to raise it as a question. As technologists, as the geniuses you are, as the leaders you are, I'd like all of us, but particularly you, to say that when we look at this technologically enabled marketplace of 2025, as citizens, as world citizens, what are we going to do to ensure that it also ensures the maximum public good? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Janice. Very interesting comments. Janice is suggesting, first of all, that sharing is for everybody, but everybody thinks that other people's spectrum should be shared, but not their own. Also, there's the issue of unintended consequences. Technology always is more advanced than the social issues. And those social and regulatory issues are the ones that always get left behind and are the ones that are the hardest to solve. And the third comment you made that I was especially resonant with is the use of the magic words. Because I've been listening to the spectral efficiency story for how many years now? And first, ultra-wideband was going to solve all our problems, and then software-defined radios were going to solve all our problems, then cognitive radio was going to do them all. and it turns out that there is no magic answer. It's a combination of everything in the right regulatory environment. So now we've had a technology viewpoint, an FCC viewpoint, a policy viewpoint. We're going to get the carrier viewpoint. Joan, your turn.
Thank you, Marty. I appreciate the invitation, and AT&T appreciates the opportunity to support this type of scientific dialogue. We agree with Commissioner Rosenworcel. Policy must be informed by the academics and by the scientists that are creating the technologies that fuel our industry. Looking into the future is certainly fascinating, but it's our experience it's very difficult to get it right. It seems the wireless industry constantly underestimates what the future will bring. And that's certainly the case for wireless network usage and the transformative powers of mobile broadband. I need to open today with two disclaimers. The first is from my legal department. John Leibowitz will appreciate this. We are in the quiet period for the FCC Spectrum Auction 97. During that period, applicants are required to avoid discussions of bids, bidding strategy, and post-auction market structure. So I will be avoiding these topics today. My second disclaimer is I'm not an engineer, but I'm smart enough to know that I should not be getting into a battle of engineering wits with the father of the modern-day cell phone. But I think Marty would be just a little bit disappointed if I didn't push back some on the construct that he has created and asked us to respond to here today. There is no doubt that LTE and LTE advanced technologies are going to drive enormous efficiencies and greater capacity into wireless networks. This is driven by multiple factors, many at play today. Carriers are already building much denser networks, relying on small cell and DAS vertical builds. In fact, AT&T this year will spend $21 billion building wireless network infrastructure in this country. That is among the highest investments in U.S. infrastructure by any company in any industry. LTE advanced technologies will also take enormous advantage of denser networks through enhanced load balancing and interference management techniques. And we will also leverage carrier aggregation, which is the capability to take non-contiguous blocks of spectrum and aggregate them together, as well as the new antenna configurations that are coming to the fore, which were explored in detail on the last panel. While these approaches will all drive significant new capacity into wireless networks, particularly in areas of very high congestion, they also have their limits. Network densification requires a location-by-location approach and significant CapEx commitments. And there are limits to how much carriers, at least currently, can manage small cell interference in a small cell environment, although, again, the prior panel shows what incredible work is being done in that area. So it's in my opinion, as we look toward the construct that Marty created, the 10 times or 100 times capacity world, that we need to use every tool in the kit. Technology, network investment, and, in my opinion, just as importantly, the struggle for new spectrum allocations, particularly as we look toward 5G. And I think that struggle has to look, I agree with Commissioner Rosenworcel completely, we need to continue to look at all flavors of spectrum, licensed, unlicensed, and importantly, sharing as well. Now, why is spectrum such an important part of the future? Because significantly increased capacity does not necessarily mean spectrum abundance. As the panelists, I think in the first panel observed, if the wireless industry builds it, our consumers tend to consume it. And that takes me to the second part of Marty's construct, where he asked us to envision exactly what a 100 times capacity world would look like and what consequences, particularly from a regulatory perspective, will follow. It's interesting to think about that world. The Industrial Revolution transformed manufacturing processes, and the Internet Revolution transformed information processes. Both drove enormous economic and social change that impacted almost every aspect of daily life. In my opinion, the wireless network revolution, which we are now entering, will marry information and machines in a way that will create explosive efficiencies driven by ubiquitous wireless connectivity, enormous analytic capabilities, and tons of data. The basic ingredients are already there: cheap sensors, ubiquitous cameras, low-cost storage, and always-on, always-available wireless connectivity. The result, an era of human-to-machine and machine-to-machine driven communications that will be predictive, reactive, self-aware, and fully transformative for the world in which we live. Now, what does this mean from a practical perspective? First, billions of devices connecting to our wireless networks. By some estimates, up to 10 billion or 100 billion networking devices by 2020. That will drive seamless interaction with the world that will be fully integrated in our every waking hour and probably even while we sleep. I think there will be connectivity both at the general level as well as a very physical and personal level, and that seems inevitable. Wearables are expected to explode. And will likely include some very specific use cases like fitness monitoring and health monitoring, as opposed to some of the general use cases that we see currently, like the new iWatch. We believe that in 2025, wireless broadband connectivity will be so immersive and interwoven into daily life that it will be largely invisible, much like electricity is today. We will take it for granted, and we will rely on it wholly. To support this revolution and the broadband interconnectivity that it will entail, we believe we need new spectrum allocations of all types. We support the FCC's current aggressive spectrum agenda, where they are looking at new allocations in 3.5 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz, and equally as importantly, they are looking currently at a new spectrum frontiers NOI to ask the question about what are the new bands that we will need to be able to incorporate into commercial wireless networks in the future, particularly as we lean toward 5G. What does this mean for the regulatory environment? I guess that depends a little bit on whether you believe 100 times capacity or more will drive spectrum abundance or not. The foundation for wireless networking today is very specific RF allocations, as Dennis's chart proved, coupled with a framework of largely exclusive licenses as well as some unlicensed use that attach to very specific rules on what a licensee can and cannot do within a specific band. When the desired uses are in conflict, which they often do, for example in LightSquare GPS model, the government must mediate and protect one use over the other. In a world of true capacity abundance, if we reach that, you would expect those disputes to become rare. On a theoretical level, network operators arguably may lose attachment to specific bands of spectrum on the theory that they will always be able to obtain replacement bands or allocations for low cost. But from a very practical perspective, operators will still strive for spectrum efficiency. The use of contiguous spectrum, I believe, will continue to be valued over the reliance on fragmented allocations. Broadband will continue to be important. And the preference for specific blocks, I believe, will remain, particularly to the extent legacy networking equipment. There are legacy networking equipment and devices that cannot easily be retuned or are designated to only to certain channels. I also believe that there will continue to be a need for licensed allocations, alongside expanded unlicensed allocations as well as shared allocations. Exclusive licensing creates contained and controllable environments in which operators can drive maximum efficiencies against minimum interference. That will always be important in the wireless world. But it is certainly possible that those exclusive licenses would be much more easily traded and available on the secondary market. I think Janice raised a number of important points about some of the political or the more public issues in terms of cybersecurity, privacy, and I think we can discuss a little bit more of those perhaps in Q&A. In close, I'm going to share with you an anecdote about spectrum sharing. Go back to 2008. The 700 megahertz auction had just closed, raising $19 billion for the U.S. Treasury. At the same time, the White Space Coalition was advocating fairly fiercely for the finalization of white space rules as well as a white space database, with the promise that white spaces could be used as the foundation for a new nationwide high-speed broadband network in as early as 2009. At the time, I remember reading on the internet a piece where the writer was pretty openly mocking AT&T and Verizon for wasting billions of dollars in the 700 megahertz auction, when in fact we could have just relied on the white space licenses to obtain spectrum for free. Fast forward to 2014. Those 700 megahertz licenses are the foundation for this country's leadership in LTE subscribership today. Without those, AT&T would not have had clear bands in which to lean forward and deploy the LTE technologies that we're all relying on with our devices now. So the bottom line, as we continue to grapple with the future of the wireless industry. We believe, again, we need to look at it all. We need to continue to strive for more licensed allocations. We need to continue to perfect access to unlicensed uses and explore new technologies. And finally, we need to continue to grapple with the difficult sharing environment to see if we can drive efficiencies there as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Joan. Believe it or not, there are some things that we are in very much agreement, namely that the market is burgeoning, that we are going to continue to have enormously increasing demands. And the other thing we agree with is that the carriers have done a very good job. So when I talked about how lousy we are at spectral efficiency, I'm talking about relative. You know, we're a trillion times better than we were when Marconi did it. But we've got another trillion times to go over the next 100 years. And the place where we do have a little bit of disconnect is in the issue of licensing. And here's where I'd like to get the group involved. And by the way, this is interactive, so I'm going to ask the first question, but I would hope that somebody in the audience, in fact, I hope all the additional questions come from the audience. Yes, there's going to be licensing in the future, but if you had what is effectively an infinite amount of spectrum, why do you ever have to have a license for an allocation? What you need now, and I'm going to ask Dennis to be the first to answer, is a license for the hardware. Because if somebody has the appropriate hardware in that system that I described, then he could just operate and will not interfere with anybody else. And will be able to perform whatever services that he or she wants to. So is the world going to change from frequency licensing to hardware licensing?
That's a good question. I think we have a regime of frequency licensing that's going to carry us on for quite a long time. But the second slide and the one that was up on the break displays, we do have enormous opportunity to better utilize our spectrum, and that's what Marty's pointing to. And even with the enormous strides that have been taken that Joan highlighted with the use of the spectrum in the 700 megahertz band is a particular example. There are very large areas where even the 700 megahertz band or any of the cellular bands are not utilized, which is an interesting contradiction. But it's not so surprising because we have urban areas where there is capacity limitation, and we have very rural areas in our large country where things are coverage limited and not capacity limited at all. So the ability to take equipment, machines that are licensed, that have a sharing capability to share whatever spectrum is not being utilized is a very powerful thought that I think we need to consider carefully. It has enormous challenges from an FCC standpoint, enforcement and all the rest. How do we make sure that these machines play by the rules? But if we can do that, that's one of the dimensions of enormously enhancing our overall capacity and our improvements in the spectrum efficiency.
Anybody else? Or are we going to have to
Marty,
license?
I'm a fan of sharing, and I'm a fan of the PCAST report, but I come forward to support licensing for some time into the future, at least for some category of national infrastructure players. If you look at some of the tougher issues going forward, prioritization, you know, in an environment where it's all sort of in the equipment, what happens when you do have some form of national crisis? Who establishes the hierarchies? Who do we turn to? There has to be, at least in my mind, for the foreseeable future, a regime where you have some set of infrastructure players who have some preferred access to some spectrum to build out these very robust networks, and then you depend on gradations of regulation depending on the role you're playing in society. I don't see a way around it in the short term, and one of my concerns, if you look at the idea of all this being embedded in the technology, at least at the low end, that's pretty costly. A lot of the sensors I'm hearing about aren't capable of being shut down or sense and avoid. I mean, the idea is a plethora of sensors of various degrees of capability. So, you know, I guess as I look at this, that world of universal sharing was tried back in the day of Lenin. You always need some form of enforcement, some form of policy to define these networks.
And Marty, I don't think you're going to be surprised when you hear that I support some licensing as well, and I think we will continue to have licensing into the future. Again, licensed spectrum gives a carrier the opportunity to drive enormous efficiency into the use of the spectrum, gives the carrier the opportunity to put together very wideband spectrum, which will continue to have value, gives the carrier the opportunity to put together geographically contiguous spectrum from market to market, which will simplify device design, I think, even into the future. And I also think that it's important because if you are going to set a set of rules that basically limits everybody's use of spectrum so you're protecting everybody else, that in itself is going to create a certain amount of inflexibility. And so I think as long as the spectrum is licensed, you have an opportunity to know who your neighbor is, your spectral neighbor is, and what they are doing. And in some ways, I think understanding that environment gives carriers greater flexibility to pursue different types of technology and deployments than would be setting sort of a common set of rules and requiring everybody to live by that.
Well, David, your turn.
So I guess going back to the Titanic example I was trying to use before, is the point I was trying to make was the original point of the spectrum licenses wasn't to manage the scarcity. It was exactly to these national security issues, public safety issues, and trying to prioritize, as Janice was saying, when do we need to allow certain priorities on the spectrum beyond just kind of the mechanical yes, no, who gets it. There's also, in addition to kind of these public interest benefits that we have to think about that sometimes aren't just purely, the efficiency point, there's also, I mean, maybe if we put the time horizon past the 2025, maybe it could work a little bit better, but in the meantime, in the next 10 years, I mean, we're still looking at the wireless carriers who have their 4G networks up are still using their 2G networks for a lot of their voice services. I think in the next 10 years, we still have a lot of legacy services that are licensed, and it's not an easy prospect, and it will probably take a little longer to phase out licensing over time, even if that's the way we were going to go with it.
I'll come back one with this. I think more the issue than whether there's licensed or unlicensed or machine controlled or whatever is the nature of the license itself. I think the license must change considerably, what the rights are based on having a license. And I think that's the critical thing. So I don't think we're going to get away from licensing. Even quote-unquote unlicensed spectrum really is still licensed. It's the license is that I mean, there are rules that you must abide by. In that sense, there's a license. And with some of the things that we're moving towards with the 3.5G, with the database-oriented licensing, it is also a license. Even if you're a general access kind of device, you're licensed in that you must interact with a database. So I think that's more the sense of things, that there is an evolution in what license means rather than whether it is licensed or not licensed.
Good. Well, I'm going to take the license of having a last word on that question because when I take the vote now, I've got two advocates of licensing forever, frequency licensing. And excuse me, Janice, for stretching you out. And Dennis, you agree with me. It's going to evolve to hardware licensing ultimately. And David, you kind of took a middle ground. So I just want to suggest that our licensing scheme today is based upon scarcity. If somebody didn't believe that there was a scarcity of spectrum, there wouldn't be licensing. We would have competition making the decisions. And if the government wanted a robust network for emergencies, they would build one because there would be lots of capacity. So my final comment on that issue, there's never been a scarcity of spectrum. I mean, take a look at what AT&T do. You're knocking yourselves out trying to get people to use more of your existing spectrum. And so my position, and I hold to it, is that there's never going to be a shortage of spectrum. The technology is going to save the day. but things are going to evolve, and competition is going to be a major, major factor. So what do we got from the audience? Vint, you got your hand up first, and I got you and somebody over there. Yeah.
So I'm Vint Cerf from Google. One thing I'd like to emphasize is Dennis's point that licensing is simply a set of rules. For a long time, the way we dealt with spectrum was to dedicate it, and I think a lot of this discussion is about not dedicating spectrum to one use, but rather finding rules that will allow that spectrum to be shared. You know, I'm thinking back to the early days of packet switching, Len Kleinrock's work and others who said, you know what, there's a better way to transmit data over broadband pipes than to dedicate narrow bands out of them. And I think that what we're talking about right now is changing the way in which we utilize this spectrum and finding rules that make it a lot more efficient. So I hope that, that all the panelists here and the people in the room will keep that focused in mind, because we really do have an opportunity to change the way in which we can communicate if we use this particular medium better.
Anybody want to comment on Vince's thing?
Yeah, I'll comment a little bit. I certainly agree that looking back on a lot of the ways spectrum was allocated and defined, it was far too inflexible. And we see that particularly as we're going forward and trying to deploy new technologies, and I'll give you a very practical example of that. AT&T has announced that we want to get into the in-flight connectivity basis. And so we need to build an air-to-ground network, and we have bands in our portfolio that we think would be useful for that. The rules don't support our ability to do that, even if we have a conversation with our spectral neighbor and agree privately with them that we're going to do it in this way and we'll protect you. And so there is still a requirement, because of the specific nature of how licenses exist today, for us to go back to the regulatory environment and ask for a rule change and or a waiver to support that usage. And I think there's been a lot of good thought about how do we transition from that environment where the rules can almost be prohibitive for new technologies and new services into one that presents more flexibility. But certainly we would not support such flexibility that you would move completely away from the ability to hold a license and utilize spectrum pursuant to a license.
Marty knew that you were going to agree with him.
Was that your comment?
No, that's a comment. No, and I think there is much more agreement, is the point that you've just made, than what may have started out to appear.
What fun is agreeing? Who is next? There was somebody over here. Please.
I can go next, or I can let them. Go ahead. Okay. My question or my comment is more along the lines of what Vint already said. We are seeing a great amount of capacity in Wi-Fi comes from managing the network well, and this was emphasized in the last panel. Similarly, moving forward, I believe that with shared spectrum and even with the licensed spectrum, really the management is the key to figuring out where the value or where the capacity from the spectrum comes. So I'm working at Microsoft Research, and we are trying to figure out strategies at MAC layer level of how to make the best use of the spectrum that's already shared. And databases is one approach, as Dennis already mentioned. So I believe the key is not really licensing, but managing the spectrum really well, or as Marty says, using the right set of bits or the right amount of cell size for which part of the spectrum we are using.
Oh, well, thank you for that comment. You want to respond?
Yeah, just a comment from me, an interesting one that follows directly from what you're suggesting, is the work that Comcast and the cable industry more generally are now performing. They're rapidly becoming a significant player in the infrastructure business, just as you've suggested, with Wi-Fi, especially as its bands of availability extend. It, with the dual port home systems, is becoming the system that has over time, the largest number of base stations, if you want to think about it that way, in the country. And it's an interesting one where, again, it's adding this management side that you just pointed to into the unlicensed world and making what has already become an integral part of our commercial network even more integrated into the infrastructure that we all depend on.
Yeah, I like to call it software-defined access networks, if you will, for people who are fans of software-defined networks. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to have another comment about Wi-Fi, but we ought to let somebody else ask a question.
Hi, good morning. Daniel Devasirvada from the Idaho National Laboratory. I wanted to probably be the lone person to express some sympathy for Mr. Goldman.
Thank you. I needed some, so.
The reason I said this was in 1992, I was the first person to make some spectrum sharing measurements in New York City from the top of the Empire State Building. And we published it. And actually, we got the patent for beacon detection method for spectrum sharing. The point was that we shut our equipment down and left it there for about 3 months before we could go back to the Empire State Building and collect it. We suddenly got this urgent call from somebody in Long Island. You are interfering with us. Shut your stuff down immediately. Well, I made sure that my stuff was off, and we called them and said, couldn't have been us. We were off. Then it was like Miss Emily Lucilla, oh, never mind, and that was the end of that. So my concern is, not only are you going to be chasing real cases of interference and trying to enforce things, you're going to be chasing the chimera of imagined interference, and people saying, oh, it's got to be that guy because he was the last guy who was going to do something unusual there. I'm not sure how you're going to resolve that. I'd like your thoughts on that and how that could temper some of this optimism that I'm hearing from everyone else.
No, I think that it's going back to, I'm just someone who talks about making things. I don't know the answer. I think it's really a hard problem, and because the public policy tension there is we don't want our rules to inhibit the development of new technologies, and if dynamic access and jumping around from frequency to frequency is the way to maximize efficiency, our rules should encourage that. But there is just the tension that you point out, and I don't know, possibly the answer is in the same technologies that are allowing us to do the access. We can somehow leverage those to be able to detect signals that are disruptive as well. But I think if you ask Joan, she would tell you, like right now, things like signal boosters, or even before now, where we currently have a lot of rules on our signal boosters, but before that, there was a lot of kind of rogue signal boosters out there that consumers were using in a lot of good ways, but also in ways that were disturbing the network, and it was virtually impossible to find them because they were moving around all the time. So if you add to that they may not even stay on the same signal all the time, it just makes it a lot more complicated. And I wish I knew the answer to that. I just think it's something that we should be baking into the thinking about this early on rather than let everything develop and then hopefully later on be able to figure out how to solve that problem.
I'll jump in on this, and actually Janice already hit the point. But as we've now come to conclude that we know to some degree how to share, this whole issue of how do we ensure that there aren't either intentional or unintentional interferers that are out there, that we have a way to get at them. So there is an activity in the CSMAC within NTIA to focus on enforcement. There is a similar activity within the Technological Advisory Council in this area. But I think it is a huge area for focus. And in fact, at this point, having spent some fair amount of time with the Enforcement Bureau inside the FCC, it's a daunting challenge for that group, and under the pressure of reduced federal funding and all of the rest, it's a daunting challenge where even providing the resources to attack the challenge is very, very difficult. So this is one that, write your congressman, more money for enforcement.
But I don't think it's an entirely enforcement problem. I think it's a question of imagined interference, where somebody accuses somebody of interfering, and then what do you do?
No. It's part of the same problem. Both the issue of detecting real interference and separating it from interference that is coming from a completely different source or doesn't exist at all. That whole issue is all part of the same package.
You know, we've reached the, excuse me for interrupting the test, we've reached the end of our time, but we've got two people standing at the microphone, so if we have two concise questions, let's
I was going to defer to my senior colleague for the first.
You go ahead, ladies first.
Okay. Andrea Goldsmith from Stanford, and I think there's a bit of a contradiction. Joan made the argument that cellular systems need license band in order to justify building out a network and offering a quality of service type service. And I think that's true, and that would perhaps argue for more spectrum for cellular systems. But then the cellular operators are also looking to move into the unlicensed band, where sharing is in its infancy. We really have very poor technology to do sharing, and we're not taking advantage of a lot of technologies out there. But even if we could, for example, the white space radios are very complex radios to get pretty poor performance because there's nothing guaranteed. So my question is, should the carriers be arguing for more licensed spectrum? And if so, why do they want to move into the unlicensed band, which is already a challenge in terms of sharing because there isn't a centralized control?
So the answer is all of the above. And I think what bands you rely on and how you deploy them in a network is dependent on what you're trying to accomplish. So without a doubt, we rely on unlicensed allocations today. I think it was been discussed by multiple panelists. Wi-Fi backhaul is a huge component of how we manage our network, and as Commissioner Rosenworcel pointed out, how we maximize the utility of our licensed bands, because we can backhaul onto Wi-Fi. But Wi-Fi is not the answer for everything. They tend to be local area networks. They can be congested and crowded. We have no control over quality of service in most Wi-Fi installations. So the licensed network, the licensed spectrum on our macro networks continues also to be a very, very essential part of our network, and we believe it will continue to do so going forward. So I go back to, we have to look at it all, and sharing is going to become, I think, also very important moving forward, just because there are not clear allocations that can be licensed to the wireless industry. Most of the allocations that are out there that the FCC is looking at for future licensing has incumbents that probably won't move quickly or at all. And so I think we need to continue to perfect sharing while we continue to look for licensed allocations and while we continue to try to foster new unlicensed allocations.
Anybody else want to respond? Paul, you have the honor of the last one.
I had a question referring to Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel's talk. She made 5 points. The very first one was about the technology competition. I was wondering whether somebody in the panel can talk a little bit about that.
I would address it. Conceptually, it makes a fair amount of sense. I'm not so sure it's going to work out that well in practice. We did that, again, if you've been around as long as I have, we've tried a lot of different things. We did that, I think, in the early Clinton era, where we did the pioneer's preference. And what you find is that you have enormous, it becomes intensely political. A lot of people made a lot of different cases. 3 different people got licenses, not entirely clear that they really were the pioneers. And in the case of something such as this, the race to the top, I guess I would suspect that given the march of technology, the winners would be a team or multiple teams. So I like the idea conceptually. I'm not really sure how it would work in practice, but certainly the spirit behind that idea, which is to promote forward thinking, is outstanding.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the notion is a terrific notion. The challenge, the logistical challenges, the legal challenges, and all the rest are very daunting. Putting together the panel, perhaps we could use the fellows, the Marconi Society fellows, to be the panel, but even at that, the way of addressing this and determining who would be the winner is very, very challenging. And then for my friends in the FCC, trying to figure out which 10 megahertz and how that would be allocated, and then what do you do with 10 megahertz when you have 10 megahertz. I think about my graduate students and them winning the prize, and then what would they do with it. There are many, many quite daunting challenges associated with it. But conceptually, if you get away from the details, the logistical details, conceptually the idea of pushing this area, which is so important to us, is terrific.
So I guess I have to put my Commissioner Rosenworcel hat back
you do.
on for that
Defend
one. And so I guess my first thing is, you guys are no fun. So I think that's the real answer here. Yeah, let's think about how to do it. Instead of thinking about why it doesn't work, let's think about how to make it work. And I think one thing, you could have a panel. Another way you could approach it that actually might be helpful in a lot of different ways is start with the prerequisite that we start figuring out a metric for efficiency. And I know a lot of people have thought about it. I know that it's not an easy thing to do. But if we do start focusing on trying to come up with how do we measure efficiency, we can not only use that for the prize, but we can also start thinking about how do you build it into things like licenses going forward to encourage, so that way the FCC can help encourage efficiency going forward. I know the market has a lot of reasons to push efficiency on its own, but I think the FCC also can have a role in helping to encourage that. But honestly, I think this was Marty that he should be speaking to this, I think, more than anything.
Why do I have the feeling that we were just getting this argument started and we could go on for at least another hour? But I'm going to take my license again as speaker, just to leave you with a thought. This system that I talked about that has infinite capacity, it's a little bit of a stretch, but I was serious. But think about what would happen if you took today's Wi-Fi as it exists now, but then upgraded by 100 times using the technologies that we talked about it earlier. And then have somebody come along and integrate all of these Wi-Fi units, which is being done in a lot of places now. You could end up with a wide area coverage system that might compete with AT&T, but cover with a different kind of service. And so what I'm suggesting is that we are a lot closer to an unlicensed model that permits wide area coverage than you might think. And my final comment is there's never been a scarcity of spectrum, and there never will be. Thank you very much to this panel. What a wonderful group this was.